Matthew fa parte della segreteria di IMPALA ed è da IMPALA deputato alle relazioni istituzionali, quindi con l'Unione Europea e tutti gli altri enti ed istituti che hanno a che vedere con la musica e con il nostro settore. Matthew si sta occupando della nuova direttiva sul copyright che è allo studio da un anno. They've been looking at the directive for a year, I think. Yeah, so less than a year. Yeah. Ci racconterà a che siamo arrivati e che cosa prevediamo. Mi dai 5 secondi? I need a few seconds just to set up your slideshow so you can start and I will follow. Yeah, if you, yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much for having me here. It's very pleasant to be in this lovely room with so many people attending. So the subject I'm going to touch upon is a bit of a drier subject than the one Marcus just presented. It's about copyright, but it's one that's very important for anyone working in the music sector, obviously. So these rules, I'm going to talk about the European Commission proposal for a directive on copyright. So the existing rules date back to 2001, and at the moment they're being revised. After years of discussion, the Commission has decided to table new rules, which they did in September of last year, so September 2016. I'll just wait a few seconds for the slides. So the proposal, as I said, published in September. It's part of a broader strategy from the Commission, which is called the Digital Single Market Strategy. It also includes rules on geo-blocking, broadcasting, audiovisual media services, online platforms. So copyright is part of a bigger package to try to move the digital single market forward. Of most interest to us, the independent music company, so I forgot to present myself, but I'm the public affairs manager at IMPALA. So my role is to go see the EU institution, the Commission, Parliament, and the member state representatives in Brussels and share the views of independents on subjects such as copyright, access to finance, competition, and many others. But today it's copyright. So the provisions we're interested in as music companies in this copyright directive are namely the value gap. We'll come back to that in a minute, but I'm sure a lot of you already know this subject. Transparency and contracts. There are other provisions in the proposed directive, one of like 3 new mandatory exceptions related to teaching, text and data mining and preservation. Those are not of direct interest to us. We keep an eye on them so that they don't become too broad, but it's not really one of our main worries. And then there's also a new right for news publishers. So again, not really our topic, but it's part of the same piece of legislation. So the value gap, to illustrate first what the value gap is, we have a few figures here. So we see that video streaming services such as YouTube, Dailymotion and others have around 900 million users worldwide, while subscription-based audio streaming services have a much smaller base of 212 million users. And to compare, we took the 2 biggest ones, one on the audio streaming world, Spotify. It pays record companies $20 per user. That was in 2015, while YouTube returned less than $1 per user. So I realize now that I should have changed this to euros, but you get the picture. And we have this digital rights agency for independent music companies called Merlin. I think it was mentioned earlier during the first panel. Merlin reported, they do a survey every year of their members, and they reported that video streaming services command 10 times more users than audio streaming services, but they return less than 10% of the value. So just to explain first, because I forgot to put this in the slide, but to explain what this value gap is in effect, it's the fact that platforms like YouTube, which are called user upload platforms, claim that they're not responsible for the content that users put on their platforms. And that means that if you own a piece of music as an artist or a label or a publisher, when you go to YouTube, they tell you it's your responsibility to notify them if a work is on the platform that belongs to you. If you want to take it down, it's your problem, it's not theirs. But they do come with some, say, agreements, which are set at a very, very low rate. So basically they say, if you want an agreement, we can do one, but this is what you're going to get, and it's really pennies, it's nothing. So you're in between these two situations. And that's what we call the value gap, that the fact that they don't feel they need licenses, so they can get away with paying a lot less than other services which also provide access to the same music. So there's really unfair competition between, say, Spotify, which needs licenses and pays more, and YouTube, which gets away with paying much less. And whatever you do, they'll always have the content, because we know users keep uploading all the time the same work. So even if you, and it's very difficult for small labels, if you try to monitor the platform to get the works down all the time, you know they keep coming back, so whatever you do, you're going to lose. So the idea, and the music sector has been pushing, the whole music sector, not just labels, but artists, organizations, publishers, managers, they all agreed that there's a need to solve this through legislation, to clarify that platforms like YouTube are responsible and they need licenses. So the Commission tabled this proposal in September, and they addressed the value gap in it. They do so this way. There are two elements to it. First, they clarify the obligation, as I said, for these services to have licenses in place if they want to have the content on their platform. And the second leg of the proposal is that it introduces an obligation for these platforms to have measures in place to monitor the works. So unless you have these measures, you're not able to monetize the works on the platform and to match the content. Yeah, we added a little note that because the Commission tabled the proposal, now it's with the Parliament and the Council, so the Member States representatives. It's a parallel track. I'll come back to that later. And some of the parliamentarians are asking for a new exception for user-generated content. It's really something we oppose because it's very broadly written, and basically it could mean that anything uploaded by a user on the platform would fall under an exception, which means that you would not be able to make any money, and it would mean that the value gap provisions would be completely meaningless. So what we believe the value gap provisions will achieve, so we've marked a few points here, to help level the playing field, so to make sure that everyone's on an equal standing, and rebalance, as I said earlier, the negotiations between the right holders and the platforms. It will make it easier for right holders and their artists to negotiate on equal terms with the platforms and increase generally the revenue coming back to the sector. It will help address the unfair competition which exists between platforms like YouTube and Spotify. Again, as I said, they don't operate under the same models. And overall, it will create a fairer online licensing environment and bring more value back to the music sector. So ultimately, what our members want is basically to be able to negotiate better rates and get more value for their artists' work. It's very simple. We believe it's a no-brainer. And it's also about removing, and Marcus mentioned the word friction. It's about removing friction in the licensing market, making sure that the market is more open and competitive, and everyone can have his or her chance in this market. So the next slide, please. There's also another, so I said we were interested in 3 elements in this proposal. One of the other elements is what they call the transparency triangle. So you have 3 articles in this proposal on the transparency. So transparency obligations, they're basically obligations for, say, labels or publishers towards their artists and their authors to set a certain standard of transparency. There's what they call the contract adjustment right. So it's the possibility for performers, in the case of labels, to renegotiate their contracts with their business partners if they feel that they've been Basically, if the remuneration they get from a certain piece of work is disproportionately low to the value created by this work. This is one we have a bit of issues with. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then there's a dispute resolution mechanism. So it's basically if labels and their performers don't agree, there needs to be a mechanism in place so that they can come to an agreement. And we also added that some MEPs, so again, the parliamentarians are able to amend the text. That's what they're doing at the moment. We're still far from the end of the process, but some of them are asking for a new right for performers, which would be paid directly by platforms to the artists through collecting societies. And that, again, I'll come back to that in a minute, is one that we have a slight problem with. So to come to our position, which we've summarized in 5 points. So our first point is really the value gap, consolidate the provisions in the Commission proposal. So we think the Commission proposal is good. It addresses the value gap, but we want to make sure the provisions in the directive are really very tight and that there's no way for YouTube and others to escape their obligations once this is in place. We dismiss an exception for user-generated content. I've just mentioned what it was, so we think if this comes in place, it would basically mean that the whole value gap provisions are null. Introducing limits to the contract adjustment clause. So I just explained what this contract adjustment clause is. We don't think necessarily that the idea is a bad one, but the way it's worded in the proposal would basically mean that all of the contracts, as soon as there's success, would be open to renegotiation with artists. And you know, if you operate as a label, you need some certainty, and you also need to be able to use the money generated by the success to pay for the less successful works. That's how it works. It's based on a solidarity model. So we think there are ways to limit this provision to make sure that it's really addressed to those who need it, those who have been, I don't know, that really got very low revenue compared to what the work generated. We are against this new equitable remuneration right for performers. It's not that we're against remuneration for performers. Obviously, we think they should be paid fairly and transparently. We believe our members do that. But we don't think this is the solution, because if you could take to illustrate this, imagine in the physical world, if retailers were asked on top of everything they already pay to pay something extra to artists directly, when we know that they're being paid through the labels and through other forms of exploitation rights. So we're against this. We're just in favor of more transparent payments to artists. And the last point is that we support the transparency obligations with just a few clarifications that I won't go into details, but if you want, I can during the question and answer session. So where we are now, so the Commission tabled in September. Now it's in the Parliament and Member States. So as I said, they both discuss the proposal in parallel. So it's taking a little bit more time on the Member State side. The Parliament is moving a bit more quickly. Again, I don't want to go into too technical details, but there are different committees looking at the same piece of legislation. One is leading and the others are giving an opinion. So we already have a vote in from last week. There's another one coming next week, and then on until end of September, when we should have the position of the Parliament. Once both sides have agreed on a position, they'll need to enter into a new phase of discussions with the Commission to try to reach a compromise. So we're still very far from the end of this process. Yeah, and the estimated date of adoption for this proposal is early 2018.